The morning sun poured through the wide windows of a small diner tucked along the main street of Monterey, California. The air was thick with the scent of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee, mingling with the soft hum of idle chatter. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's names, where a glance could reveal a regular's favorite dish before they even placed an order. The hum of conversation filled the space, as newspapers rustled and coffee cups clinked. It was just another Tuesday morning, or so it seemed, until the door creaked open. A hush rippled through the room, as an elderly black man, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit and polished shoes, stepped inside. His cane clicked gently against the floor with each careful step. Despite his slight stoop, his posture was dignified, steady, unwavering. He surveyed the room briefly, then made his way to an empty corner booth. As he sat, a subtle shift fell over the diner, an energy that couldn't be ignored. The group of men near the counter exchanged quick, sidelong glances. A woman, cradling a stroller, paused mid-sip, her hand frozen in the air. There was no overt hostility, no glaring, no shouting, but something else was there. Unspoken, palpable. The waitress, young and blonde with her hair tied in a loose ponytail, moved swiftly between tables. Her pace was brisk, menus handed to one booth, coffee topped off at another, an order taken from a man in a flannel shirt. But when her eyes met the elderly man's, she faltered. For a moment, their gazes locked. She gave him a curt nod, then quickly turned away, walking back toward the counter without another word. Time dragged on. Minutes passed, but the elderly man remained seated, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his gaze flicking briefly over the laminated menu, though it was clear he had already made his choice. He never once raised his voice or complained. He simply waited. But the atmosphere thickened. The tension was no longer subtle, it became a quiet storm, gathering force in the silence. The man raised his hand, a small, polite gesture. A signal for service. His eyes never left the waitress. She glanced up, caught his eyes for a fraction of a second, but didn't acknowledge him. Instead, she poured coffee at another table and disappeared into the kitchen. No words. Just the soft murmur of the diner around him, the hum of conversations, the clinking of silverware. Still, no one spoke up. The discomfort swirled beneath the surface, felt by everyone, yet no one dared to address it. A middle-aged woman at a nearby table frowned, but quickly returned to her phone, lost in its screen. The young couple at the table across from him whispered, eyes darting nervously. But they, too, refused to make eye contact. The elderly man raised his hand again. This time, higher. His hand hovered in the air for several long seconds, his fingers slightly trembling, but steady. He was patient. He wasn't asking for attention, only for a simple acknowledgement. But when the waitress walked by again, balancing a tray of drinks, he lowered his hand slowly. His shoulders slumped just slightly, as if the weight of the situation was pressing down on him. And still, no one intervened. The busboy, a teenager who had been clearing tables, lingered by the kitchen door, eyeing the elderly man. His brow furrowed as he watched the waitress stride past, but he hesitated to say anything. Softly, he leaned toward her. "Hey, that guy in the corner, he's been waiting a while," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll get to him," the waitress replied, her voice curt. She brushed past him, quickening her steps. The busboy stared after her, unsure of what to do next, but chose not to press the issue further. Back at the booth, the elderly man adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly. He wasn't causing a scene. He wasn't raising his voice. But there was a quiet intensity to his presence that amplified the silence surrounding him. His calm demeanor only served to highlight the unease that had settled like a heavy fog over the room. Then, the door to the diner opened once more. The bell jingled sharply, slicing through the thick tension, breaking it apart like a crack in the ice. A woman in her early 30s stepped inside, her heels clicking confidently against the tile floor. She wore a tailored blazer, her hair styled neatly, and carried an air of authority that turned heads. Her gaze scanned the room, and when her eyes fell on the elderly man in the corner, her face immediately brightened with recognition. "Dad," she exclaimed, her voice ringing out with warmth. A wide smile spread across her father's face as he stood up, and the two embraced tightly, the quiet that had enveloped the diner evaporating in an instant. Every eye in the room shifted to them, as if the very air had been charged with the weight of the moment. The waitress, who had been pouring coffee at another table, froze mid-pour. Her hand trembled slightly as she stared at the pair. The young woman pulled back from the embrace, looking her father up and down. "You haven't been served yet?" she asked, her tone sharp with disbelief. The elderly man glanced around the room, his voice steady as he replied, "Not yet." Her expression darkened, and without hesitation, she turned toward the waitress. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the silence. The waitress blinked, her face pale, then turned slowly. "Yes?" she asked, quieter than before. "My father has been sitting here for nearly an hour," the young woman demanded, her voice firm and unyielding. "Why hasn't he been served?" The waitress opened her mouth, but no words came. She glanced toward the kitchen, seeking some form of support, but there was none. She stammered, "I was just about to get to him." The young woman's eyes narrowed, and her voice took on a sharp edge. "Really? Because it sure looks like you've been deliberately ignoring him." The waitress's face flushed with embarrassment. She fumbled for an excuse, but the young woman cut her off before she could continue. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice like steel. "Everyone in this room saw what happened. You had no problem serving every other table." The murmurs began, quiet at first, but growing as the truth settled over the room. A few patrons nodded subtly, their discomfort now transforming into quiet agreement. The silence thickened once more, but this time, it wasn't just discomfort. It was accountability. The tension was no longer a quiet storm, it was the weight of a truth that couldn't be ignored. The young woman turned back to her father, her expression softening. "I'm sorry, Dad. You shouldn't have had to deal with this." He smiled gently, patting her hand, but his eyes betrayed the quiet hurt he was holding back. "It's all right," he said, though the pain was there, hidden just beneath the surface. But his daughter wasn't finished. She had one more thing to say. And when she spoke, the room fell into stunned silence. Whispers rippled through the room, a subtle hum that spread like wildfire. "That man you ignored for the past hour." One patron murmured to another. "He's not just a customer. He's my father, and I own this restaurant." The atmosphere froze. Every head turned toward the waitress. Her face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to form words, but none came. The weight of the revelation hung in the air like a heavy, suffocating fog, pressing down on every person in the diner. You own the place?" The waitress finally whispered, her voice trembling. "That's right," the young woman responded, her tone unwavering. "I've poured my heart into this business. I built it to be a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of who they are. And today, you've disrespected not only my father but everything this restaurant stands for." The waitress took a shaky step back, gripping the coffee pot as though it might somehow anchor her. "I didn't mean to. I just—" Her voice trailed off, the excuse hanging in the air, sounding hollow, even to her own ears. "You just what?" The young woman's voice rose, cutting through the tension. "Thought you could decide who deserves respect and who doesn't? Thought no one would notice?" She swept her hand toward the room, her gaze daring them all to remain silent. Well, everyone noticed. The patrons sat frozen, some shifting in their seats, a few exchanging guilty glances, remembering their own moments of inaction, the moments they hadn't spoken up. The young woman scanned the room, her eyes locking onto each table in turn. "And to the rest of you." Her voice softened but remained firm. "Why didn't anyone say anything? Why did you all sit here and let this happen?" A man at the counter cleared his throat awkwardly. "I didn't want to get involved," he muttered, his eyes glued to his coffee cup. The young woman's gaze sharpened, her words like daggers. "Silence is complicity. When you see something wrong and say nothing, you're part of the problem." Her words hung in the air, the weight of them sinking deep into every soul in that room, cutting through the silence with brutal clarity. The elderly man reached out and placed a gentle hand on his daughter's arm. "Let it go, sweetheart," he said softly. "They've heard enough." She turned to him, her expression softening, the fire in her eyes dimming. "Dad, you deserve better. This shouldn't have happened." He smiled, a quiet strength radiating from him. "I know. But the lesson has been learned." The waitress, now visibly shaking, stammered, "I'm so sorry, I wasn't thinking. Please. I'll do better." The young woman regarded her for a long, silent moment, her gaze steady, unwavering. "You'll have the chance to prove it," she said at last. "But if I see anything like this again, you're done." The room fell back into an uncomfortable silence, thick with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. But the lesson was far from over. The young woman stepped back, her gaze sweeping the room once more. This restaurant, she began, her voice ringing out, was built on the values of kindness and respect. Not just because it's good for business, but because it's the right thing to do. Every person who walks through that door deserves to be treated with dignity. No exceptions. The waitress nodded vigorously, her cheeks flushed with shame. I promise I'll make it right. I'll apologize to him properly. The young woman's expression softened, but her voice remained firm. You'll do more than that. You'll reflect on why you acted the way you did today and make sure it never happens again. I'm giving you this chance because I believe people can change. But it's up to you to prove it. The waitress swallowed hard, nodding again. I understand. Thank you. The young woman turned back to her father, her expression softening once more. Let's get you that breakfast you came here for. But her father chuckled softly, shaking his head. I think I've lost my appetite for eggs and bacon. Let's go home, sweetheart. As father and daughter stood to leave, the patrons, who had remained so silent, began to stir. A woman from the far corner stood hesitantly. Ma'am, she said, her voice timid, I want to apologize. I saw what was happening, and I should have spoken up. It wasn't right to just sit and watch. The elderly man smiled warmly at her, his voice kind and encouraging. Now is a start, he said gently. The next time you see something, don't hesitate. Speak up. You might make all the difference. A few others nodded, their faces lined with guilt and newfound resolve. The tension that had gripped the room began to lift, replaced by an air of reflection. The young woman took her father's arm, guiding him toward the door. As they passed the waitress, she stopped and spoke quietly but firmly. I expect better from you, for everyone's sake. Yes, ma'am, the waitress murmured, her head bowed as they exited. Outside, the sunlight seemed brighter as it bathed the street in a warm glow. The elderly man paused, leaning on his cane, and looked at his daughter with pride. You've become a remarkable woman, he said softly. She smiled back at him. I learned from the best. Inside the diner, the staff and patrons were left to reflect. Their usual morning routines were disrupted by something far more important, something they couldn't ignore anymore. A lesson about compassion, courage, and the power of doing what's right. The father and daughter walked down the bustling street, their steps in sync. As they moved away from the diner, the elderly man paused, tapping his cane lightly against the pavement. You know, he said, his tone thoughtful, sometimes it takes a moment like this to remind people what really matters. His daughter nodded, her gaze focused ahead. You're right, Dad. People need to be reminded that their actions, or their silence, can have consequences. If no one speaks up, nothing changes. The elderly man smiled, his expression filled with quiet wisdom. And you've done your part today. Not just for me, but for everyone in that room. They continued their walk, their bond stronger than ever, leaving behind a powerful example of standing up for what's right. Inside the diner, the lesson lingered, inspiring some to rethink their choices and others to resolve to do better in the future. What would you have done in that diner? Would you have spoken up? This story is a reminder of the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. It's also a call to action for all of us. When you see something wrong, don't stay silent. Speak up. Take a stand. Your voice might be the one that changes everything. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire reflection and action. Let's make a difference together, one story at a time.